Are you looking for a company that checks all the boxes? Waldorf Essentials provides homeschool curriculum written by homeschoolers for homeschoolers. We provide many options from digital to hard copies and individual blocks. Visit waldorfessentials.com.
Welcome to this week's podcast. I'm super excited to have one of my heroes here with me tonight. Please welcome Susan Perrow. She is a therapeutic storyteller from Australia. She works to develop stronger families by teaching methods to parents, to teachers. She's done keynotes and she teaches classes on how to bring wonderful therapeutic stories to our children. And I am just really pleased to have you here tonight. So thank you so much for joining me. And y'all are in for a treat. She's going to read us a little bit from the beginning of her book, and then we're going to dive into some of the questions that have been submitted to us. So please, Susan, it is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa. Lovely introduction. And I do like to begin with an honoring, because this whole interview is about stories, honoring the thousands of years of stories and storytelling that have come before us. And this is really, it's out of deep respect for Indigenous cultures. I'm reading out of the introduction to my latest book, Stories to Light the Night, which isn't just for children, stories for teens and adults. But here in my introduction, before books, before writing, for thousands of years, many thousands of years, oral storytelling and stories were integral to our humanity. The storyteller was the carrier of folklore and morals, the teacher and the healer. His or her words were a soothing and strengthening and motivating balm for children and adults alike. In many Indigenous cultures, story embraced and still embraces everything: all life, connectedness, nature, and community. Stories were created that wove nature threads into healing journeys, and to this day continue to weave their healing work. The world has so much to learn from this wisdom, and we have so much to learn from this wisdom. And it is this deep foundation that gives me strength in the work that I do.
That is so beautiful. I think that story is so discounted by people on the outset, but they don't realize that every facet of their life, every day, has some sort of story element in it, whether it's some adult craziness that's been invented or it's something that's deliberate, right? So stories are so important, and we want to be very deliberate in bringing our stories. I will say that my first introduction to you was this book, many moons ago, Healing Stories for Challenging Behavior. And I have recommended it time and time again, but it is only one of many books that you have, right? So you just talked about another one, Stories to Light the Night is the newest one, correct?
Yes, the newest one. The second book after the one you just showed is Therapeutic Storytelling. That's another 101 stories. And then my third book was one I wanted very much as a family collection. It doesn't have theory in it. It's an A to Z of behavior tales, 42 stories, and they all have lovely little black and white sketches.
Oh, that's lovely.
And they have stories for character development as well. Mm-hmm. It's not that you just think, oh, well, my child doesn't have a challenging behavior, I don't need these stories. They are all for character development as well.
Absolutely. I remember when I had this book on my shelf for a while, and I have 5 children. Most of them are grown. I have 2 left at home. But I had this book on my shelf, and my aunt died, and my mom was trying to craft a story that would encompass and engage the children that were going to be at the funeral. And I said, I have just the book for you. And I took her this book, and she read from this book at the funeral, and all of the children were rapt to attention. And so I just think that it's it's such a beautiful space to be able to bring story at so many different points in our lives. It influences our everyday. every day. So share with me a little bit about your therapeutic storytelling journey.
Uh-huh. Well, I do like to talk about this because I was not born a story writer. I really didn't have much interest in creative work. My passion was mathematics.
Mm.
And I did honors maths at school. Yes, I was a maths and science student. And it was when I was parenting my three sons, they were born quite close together. And just out of common sense, I would read them stories at bedtime, certainly not let them fall asleep in front of a screen.
Right.
And for many examples that are documented in that first book, I started observing stories making a difference to their attitudes and behavior. And perhaps the scientist in me thought, I've got to research this more. I've got to experiment with it more. And by then I was teaching, and I started in a respectful way, creating little stories. If a child was pinching, Cranky Crab developed out of that a situation of a child pinching other children.
Right.
Trying to encourage the children in the classroom to help tidy up, and my little straw broom story was developed out of that. And so for many years teaching, I would be not on an everyday basis, maybe even just a couple of times a year, but I think I have to thank my grandfather. He was just a meticulous documenter. So I always would document, this story, it helped this age group and it did this. And it was that all those extra notes, because that's what's so connected to therapeutic stories. It's not just about a story. It's about what came before, then the story, and then did the story help? And if it helped, how did it help? And so that's what, when I did find my publisher, Hawthorne Press, they seemed very delighted to include all of that and not just have a bunch of stories all in a row.
And I think that that's really so important, right? As parents.
It puts it in real life, and it's, I mean, and if you could meet some scientists these days and they'd say, story make a difference? No, where's the proof of that? Well, our only proof is in this qualitative documentation, and not that, I don't need any proof. All you need is one little experience, and it is so, especially for parents, so empowering that you made a difference, even if your child is getting dressed in a more fun way because you've made up a little story about hickory dickory dance, it's time to put on your pants. Hickory dickory do, now let's put on your shoes. That's what the little boy in Hickory Dickory Land does each morning. Even little nonsense stories can make a difference to your daily life.
They do make a difference. And I think when we can approach things as a parent in that way, we're not angry. We have to decide to be in that space of wanting to nurture them. And when we are, we can look at something like a child getting their clothes on and not be so angry and frustrated, and instead sort of drop into this connection time, this connection moment. And all children love, like, I could tell my 18-year-old son a story right now and he'd be wrapped in it.
Yes. And it is something that we have lost in our modern time. I've been fortunate to have had quite a few years working in Africa, and I remember sitting next to an old African grandmother, and she was watching her daughter trying to dress the 2-year-old grandson. And the daughter was getting upset because he wouldn't keep still. And then she was going into all the rationalizations of why, you need to wear this today and we need to wear that, or you'll get cold and you'll get sick and you'll have to go to hospital. And the grandmother turned to me and she just sighed and she said, I used to story or sing the clothes onto my children. And there was so much wisdom in that. And I have learned a lot by having time with different cultures that is fed into my work as well. So even if we remember that, how can we story or sing, or both. Sometimes stories are musical.
Right.
How can we, not in every way, of course, if the child's about to run across a road
Of
and you
course.
know there's a truck coming down the road, you're not going to wait to become creative and make up a story. There's times for just hold my hand now, and no question about it. But there are many times we can story or sing or rhyme our way through life.
I agree. I have a few children that were not naked in life because of stories that I sang to them and that as they were getting dressed, because they were so busy. And I have 3 sons and 2 daughters, so I completely understand that space of like, oh my goodness, they're so busy. I have to do something to engage, or else I'll lose my mind. And story is such a beautiful way to engage. Can you share a memorable experience that you have where storytelling played a pivotal role for you?
Oh, I have so
Just
many.
one. I know you have so many. Pick a handful.
Well, I'd like to, I did think beforehand, and I'm going to give 2 examples here to just show a contrast.
Okay.
And one of them was I was in Croatia running trainings. This isn't for young children, but I think it's important we embrace stories for older ones as well. And a mother of a 17-year-old came to my training, and her daughter had lost she had muscular dystrophy and she couldn't walk anymore. And she was in a very depressed, angry state, wouldn't get moved from her bedroom. The parents had bought a wheelchair and the daughter was adamant, there's no way I'm going to be seen in that ugly thing. Now, this mother, and I guess I was a bit like a midwife, I helped the process, and she crafted this story. It was only half a page, and it was the daughter had inherited the disease from the grandmother, and the story was about a black stone necklace that the daughter was given by the grandmother, and the daughter wore the necklace with pride, and everywhere she went the necklace was there, beautiful around her neck. But as she got older, she started to find that the necklace was getting heavier and heavier, and she would go ice skating, and sometimes the weight of the necklace would pull her down, or she'd be trying to climb stairs and the necklace was too heavy, she couldn't go up. But then the necklace one day became so heavy, the girl fell to the ground and the black stone in the middle cracked open, and a light in the stone shone a way forward. That was all she had. Of course, it wasn't anything about a wheelchair. That's the last thing you would do. Well, you wouldn't do it with a therapeutic story. Yes, that's right. And I'm sure this girl had had many visits from family, friends, and grandparents, and being told, you should be using the wheelchair. The parents are trying to help you, So this story was very well written. It had an open ending, which is quite unusual from my experience with a therapeutic story. Had an open ending. Just seeing my head's a bit cut off. But it left the teenager room to come to a conclusion. And the mother typed out the story, left it with the girl in her room, also had bought an amethyst, because when the black stone cracked, there was an amethyst light. It was her daughter's favorite gemstone. And sometimes a little talisman connected with the story can strengthen it. So she already had bought an amethyst ring for the girl's birthday. And so instead of waiting for the birthday, she gave it early, and she left the ring in the story. The next morning, the girl called from the bedroom to her parents, I'm ready to use the wheelchair. Now, the mother came and found me a few days later. I was giving a talk, and the mother came and approached me, and I thought she was upset because she had tears streaming down her face, and she just put her head on my shoulder and sobbed, but it was sobbing of joy. And then this continued, because 6 years later, I'm back in Zagreb running trainings, and I get a knock on the door saying, it was a bit embarrassing because there wasn't wheelchair access to the venue where I was working. And there was a knock on the door saying, there's someone outside to see you. And I looked down the stairs, and there is this young woman, now 23, not 17, sitting in her wheelchair with a huge bunch of flowers for me. And she said she wanted to thank me for coming to Zagreb 6 years before. She was now at university. She was a disability advocate, and had made a lift put in the main lecture hall and ramps up to all the rooms.
Wow.
And she just wanted to be there to thank me. Now, that's
so beautiful.
If no other story had made a difference, that for me was enough encouragement to continue this work.
Absolutely.
And of course, I write a lot of stories, but my work helping others write stories and then getting the feedback of the difference they can make. Not always, of course, a story isn't the only way to address a challenge, but when it can help. So there is a very powerful, very beautiful example of a story that made a huge shift in not just the teenager's life, but for the whole family.
That was beautiful.
And then another end of the spectrum, you could say, we can be using stories, perhaps even just making them up on the spot to make a tiny change for a situation. And this happened to me a few years ago. I'd been invited to go to a tea party by a mother who loved reading my stories to her daughter. And when I accepted, she was a bit like you. Oh my goodness, I can't believe Susan's going to come. She didn't know how much I love tea parties. And so I arrived there. She lived locally, so it was easy for me. So I arrived there, and the little 3.5-year-old is playing with her dolls on the floor. And the mother, oh, so exciting, Susan's here. And the table, you could see the table was set, and there was a cake and some biscuits and flowers and a bowl of fruit and 3 plates, and everything was laid out. And she said to me, come, we're all ready for you. And then she called her daughter to come to the table. And the daughter said, no. I've decided I'm not coming to the tea party. Well, the mother then did her best in giving, but it was your idea, and you came to the supermarket and we worked out what cake we were going to make, and you helped me make the cake. But the more the mother was reacting to this strong situation, the more the little girl was, it was attention. It was gorgeous attention for her sitting there. And I could just, usually I don't like to interfere, but the mother just looked at me and mouthed, help. Can you help? Can you do anything? And I'm not usually very good at making up stories on the spot, but it just, sometimes a funny, exaggerated story is just what's needed in a situation like this. And I looked at the table and I cupped my hand over my ear and I said, I heard that the table is having a party and inviting all its friends to come to the party. It's invited a bowl of fruit and a cake. And then I just looked, I had all my information for the story right there. And then I kept kind of stretching the story out. And now, who else is invited to the party? And I pretended to listen, and out of the corner of my eye, I'm watching the girl sit up. She stopped playing, listening. So I knew that I had her attention. And so I continued. And of course, the tables invited 3 chairs and 3 plates. And the tables invited Mummy. And the tables invited me, lucky me. But the table can't remember. Sure, there's one more guest for the party. And by then, she had hopped on that chair.
I bet.
and was almost patting her chest. It's me.
It's
It's me. Yes. And so it's a storied situation. And it just diffused, all the tension had gone. The little girl was so delighted by the playfulness of it. And of course she wanted to have cake and biscuits and fruit and so on. And so two very different situations. But over the year, 30 or more years I've been doing this work, I have many, many examples. And it is so encouraging for me to continue this work. Sometimes I say to my husband, do you think I'll ever retire? I'm slowing down a bit. I run online trainings, but I do them in clusters. So I sort of build up the energy. And I've started to surf again. And so the surfing is giving me lots of energy for all of this. But I feel so honored to be doing this. My last training was for 20 psychologists and social workers inside Ukraine, working with families with unimaginable, difficult situations.
That actually is a good segue into my next question. So, like with all the fear and anxiety that we seem to have so much of today, how do you see using therapeutic storytelling to sort of help families? And how would you recommend that for families that, really feel like they're in the thick of it right now?
Well, in so many different ways. I mean, when COVID was around, you're probably aware, I wrote the little gnome who had to stay home. Did you know about my COVID story? That was my one experience of absolutely going viral. I had 43,000 hits on my Facebook in one night. And then in 2 weeks, the story was in 26 languages. All of them are on my website if people want to source this story in different languages. But then with the anxiety building back to school, I was contacted by an education department in a state in Australia, Victoria. Could I write a sequel? Could I write Back to School for Little Gnome to help overcome this anxiety? So just on that level for children, yes, I did write a story and I put it out. All of these are free on my website. I feel that's my contribution. I know I get paid for my books, but then there's many stories I put out for free. And I brought in the little gnome, he had his pack on his back and he's setting off for the first time outside his front door, going along the forest path. And it's just all too much. And he turns around to go back home. This little bird, this golden bird, lands on his shoulder and sings this song. And the gnome hears the words of the song: with my pack on my back, I will follow the track. I will sing my song back to school today. Oh, there's some rhyme in there. I haven't got the words quite right. And so he does. And then other little gnomes come out of the forest and they're all singing together and they all end up at school. And then they are enjoying doing what they do at school, painting and crafting. So on that small level, not small, it's nothing small for little children, but for stories for anxiety for little children. However, and I'm going off on a tangent here, I may write stories sometimes for young children, like my little gnome who had to stay home. I was contacted by an 80-year-old man who thanked me for that little gnome story because it helped him realize that, I've got to be home, so I need to find things to do. And he bought art boards and he taught himself to paint. And he feels it was the little gnome story that set him off on that pathway.
So sweet.
So it is a wonderful example that we can often think stories are for this age, but we can never box them. They're too alive. They're too alive to be boxed. But then there's other big situations with anxiety, and I'll share one of the stories written by these Ukrainian psychologists last month. And this was to help families who've had to move from their villages on the front line and move to a safer part of Ukraine, or even across the border into Romania or another country. And how, well, they chose to write about snails. So it was about a family of snails whose valley, black bats swept into the valley, and the snails were fearful for their life and they had to escape. And the only escape ways were under logs and through, so they couldn't be seen. And the escape routes were so tiny, the snails had to leave their shells behind, which was such a powerful metaphor. So they arrive in their new place and they have to find a way to grow back their shells. Wow. Now, this is addressing probably some of the worst anxieties that families could ever have.
Absolutely.
And then they bring in, when I'm teaching there's many ways to write therapeutic stories, so I'm never claiming I can offer the only way, but I do talk about helping metaphors and obstacle metaphors on the pathway. So they bring in this helping metaphor of the snails meet a turtle in their new land. And the turtle tells a story. He says, in my distant memory, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, they once lost their shells and they had to find a way to grow them back. And then at the point at the end of the training, they were still working on some little mantra or chant, because this isn't just a story for children, this is for adults too.
Right.
That encapsulates finding one tiny thing each day, that finding the joy even in one tiny thing each day may help slowly grow your shells back again. Absolutely. So that's sort of the arc of the story, and just how extreme. And then sometimes there can be some quite, not humorous, but I think quirky ways that we can work with therapeutic stories. And one that I did write for children, to do with children who were anxious about trying new things. And in Australia, we have an animal called a quokka. It's part of the kangaroo family.
Mm-hmm.
It only lives in a certain part of Australia on an island off the coast of Western Australia, possibly a little bit on the mainland there. It has an extraordinary ability. It looks like it's always smiling.
Oh.
But this little quokka, he didn't want to smile, but he also didn't want to learn how to jump. Now, of course, if you know kangaroos, that's what they do.
They do.
And so it's on the app, actually. And so you can
I'll have to look for it. We'll talk about the app in the end.
Yes. So it's called The Little Quokka Who Didn't Want to Jump. And through a journey, I'm leading the listeners, the children, through all the, oh yes, but it's too hard, into okay, I found a way.
That's so lovely.
So there's many different kinds of anxiety and different levels, and so there can be many stories connected with.
Absolutely. I think about some of the stories that I've heard where, from other storytellers as well, where when it doesn't feel like there's a way in, and then you see somebody else do it, and then you have that, you go, oh, now I can do that. And it allows the person that's listening to the story to really have that confidence that, wait, even though that looks really hard, I think I can do that. I think because we're, within the story, we're allowing that space of helping them build their confidence a little bit. So that's a really beautiful piece. I wonder.
Yes, but I think the key is to find a way to do it so you're not sounding like it's teacher talk.
Absolutely agree.
You're not being conceptual. You let the story journey. I've got that little cocker story here. I'm just trying to,
Has to be abstract enough that they will not think that you're preaching to them.
absolutely not. No.
And because I really believe that even the youngest of children will know if you're preaching to them. If you are trying too hard, it will come out. And so you really have to be thoughtful when it comes to that.
Yeah. Yes. So, yeah.
Yeah. So good. So where do you look for your biggest inspiration? Where do you find that?
In nature.
That's a good
Lots
one.
of inspiration in nature. However, I don't find all my images, metaphors for my stories in nature. But going on a walking, the movement of walking, I think is so important for me, even if it's raining. If I'm trying to work on a story, my husband would tell everyone I will just walk around the lounge room. But if I can get out on a beach or get into a park and walk, there's a beautiful saying from the San people in Southern Africa: a story is like the wind. It comes from a far off place and you feel it. And that's exactly what works for me. I feel like I'm walking, even if there isn't a wind blowing, I still feel something comes into me.
Absolutely agree with that. I always find that walking moves the brain. It moves the emotion.
Yes. So I get inspiration from that. I certainly encourage people who haven't written stories before to read lots of folk and fairy tales, just to get a feeling of structure and patterns in stories. So that's another helpful thing to do. I get inspiration from the people who are doing my trainings and just the different difficulties they are facing.
Challenges.
That really inspires me to keep doing this work. And sometimes I feel I have to exercise my story writing muscle, you could say. It's not really the right word for it, but I just need to exercise my imagination. And so I have lots of little cards with story words on them, and at random pick a couple out of a bag. This is one of the exercises I do in my trainings that I run. And just picking them out at random, it can be, you might pick out feather and rabbit. So we've got two very not connected things.
Right.
And how can we create a story?
Right.
And also, I just to take the tension away, don't even think it has to be a therapeutic story. Just how can we create a story where we have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Of course, that's kind of a classic, simple story, but there's a problem. See, if there's not a problem to be solved, it's not really a story. It's just a description. A rabbit was hopping along, finds a feather, and takes the time and puts it in his rabbit burrow. But if there could be so many possibilities. You see, does the rabbit have a problem?
Rabbit could have a left feather that he loses, and how could he find it? And then the story can become about that.
Or the feather might have a problem. And so, or the rabbit and the feather together might solve a problem that perhaps the king of the land has. There were so many possible. It's a delicious exercise to do.
It's very beautiful and fun.
Yeah.
We do that sometimes when all of my children are together. We'll do just one person says a word, and then the next person has to do some kind of story, and then it goes from there. And it's a continual story. So I think that's a fun way to exercise.
That's another fun way.
Have to exercise those storytelling muscles. I also tell moms, listen, if you're having a hard time coming up with something and going for a walk in nature did not help, sit and look at what your children's toys look like right now after they've left them. What are those toys?
Yes.
What
Yes.
what things could be going on? Because what was going on in your child's mind to set them up that way? So what story can you make about the toys and what they're doing? I did
Yes.
a lot when my children were young, and they would come back and want to know, how did you know what I was thinking? How did you know what the toys were doing? Like,
Yeah.
in it becomes a fun thing. That's not, of course, not a therapeutic story generally, but it exercises those storytelling muscles so that we can start to get to that place where we can come up with a therapeutic story. And it really has to start somewhere. We have to find a place for the medicine to begin, and it can't begin if it's not,
Mhm.
if we don't take that chance. So many people are so afraid that their children are not going to like their stories. And I think you just have to step out there and tell a story about something, an experience you had in your life, but you don't have to be so direct. It doesn't have to be about.
Absolutely. And those therapeutic stories don't just belong in one box. Every kind of story has a potential to be therapeutic because it depends very much on who's listening and
Right?
how
Absolutely.
it speaks to you. But
Right.
just going back, I'm glad you mentioned the toys because we can find ideas in everyday objects.
Yes.
Just recently, I'd been wanting for years to write a story about cooperation, and I just couldn't find. Often these sit in my mind, and I'm driving along, or I'm walking along, or just this particular time sitting in the kitchen, looked over to the corner and saw the dustpan and brush. Do you call them that in America? The little
Yes.
pan that the brush
Mhm.
sits in.
Yep. A broom and dustpan. A broom. It would probably be a broom.
Uh-huh. And I think my husband's been a builder by trade, so a very different occupation, but I think he's
Mhm.
amused sometimes. And went, maybe it was breakfast time. Oh my gosh, I've just found my story. Because how can a dustpan and brush work if they don't cooperate? And so
Right.
that's
They have to work
exactly the
together.
story. Yes. So
Yeah.
that's exactly the story I ended up writing. And it's a little bit of humor in it, but it's also quite serious. And
Right.
I think it could be a story for all ages, for, if committees aren't working together, if,
Absolutely.
yes.
We all need story,
Mm.
one of my sons is having some struggles with his girlfriend. I said, "You could tell her a story." And he's like, "Mom, I don't know about that." I said, "No, you come from a long line of storytelling. You should just sit and think about a story." So I think we all need stories. Doesn't matter how old we are. And we all really, like approach the story differently, depending on who the person is that's hearing it. So I
Yeah.
find storytelling to be so important, and it's really a talent that we all have. We just have to like settle into it,
Yes.
and take the
It's
time.
interesting that we even feel we have to justify because
Right.
it is so integral to our humanness. We're not just a rational brain. We're our imaginative way of learning and knowing is equally important to the
Agree.
rational side of learning and knowing. And
Agree.
yet, and cultures in the past knew that. But now I think that I've read a book where the writer talks about the dominant sibling. The rational brain has been so dominant over the past 100
Right.
years or more that we feel we have to justify why we need to come back to
Right.
using stories. And yet it's such a probably the first thing humans did.
I
They could
agree.
speak, told
1000%. I don't think we
stories.
ever outgrow them.
Yes.
I don't think we ever outgrow them. And I think, and so many people, maybe they live a more mainstream life, they don't realize every time you go to a movie, it's a story. Every time,
Yes.
every person you're talking to, it's a story. So
Yes. Sure.
you're just taking that space and magnifying it for what is necessary, because we're constantly telling stories. In the marketing world, it's all about what story you're telling. It's all about,
Mm.
from a business perspective, it's all about what story we're telling our audience. And so I think that so often people dismiss it, but they shouldn't. It's pretty amazing. I want to grab a couple of questions that people had asked us on our social media. And one person asked, do you have a story idea for a child who uses the word sorry quite often in her communication with friends? This happens in questions that could be directly stated instead of always being prefaced with a sorry, like, okay. And I noticed this a lot, like probably around how most children that I notice it in is they're probably somewhere between 10 and 13. And it's a habit that we have to really help them break because we don't want them to turn into grown-ups that are apologizing constantly.
Yes. And perhaps the adults have already talked about it. So we need to find another way in.
Probably so. Yes, because it can't be so direct.
What came to mind when I first read this question, I would find it hard to find a serious story to approach this because it might sound too close to the, could be too hard to find a journey that's not close to the situation. But if, for example, you had a pen, perhaps the pen has a limited amount of ink and the pen's trying to be very efficient and work out what needs to be in a sentence and what doesn't. But then pens are from the old time, we're probably talking more written communication is probably on the messages on the phone or messages on a computer.
Maybe.
But you could still find a way. Perhaps it's the story is set in the land of words, and there's a limited time, limited amount of words that can be used before they disappear for a while. They need to rest. Yes. Yeah, there could be different approaches. So I haven't got a full story.
No, I think that's
thinking out of the box.
Great ideas, because I love the idea of it being kind of the economy of words. How many things do we need to say? And I love the idea of a story like that. And many of us are still using pens.
Okay.
Especially while the children are using fountain pens and
Sure.
no, I agree. I think about, a great story would be thinking about what if you had a long writing to do and you wrote the word sorry at the beginning of every sentence?
Yes.
How much more writing you would have? It would be so much more. And pretend you were writing with a stick crayon. That would take even longer than a pen. So yes, I completely agree. That's a great.
Yeah, you could have a bit of fun with that. Sure.
That is a great one. Let's see. Let's see. Can you tell me like some actual parenting responses when children are having meltdowns? That seems to be a question that I get all the time because I'm a parent coach too. But I always love to hear how different people answer that question. This mom has a sensitive 3-year-old, but I think it doesn't matter if they're 3 or 30.
Yes. Well, I wrote a story for one of my grandchildren who would do exactly that. And this is one example, but there could be many. This was about a beekeeper, and the beekeeper would keep getting really angry when the bees weren't producing honey more quickly. And eventually he's getting so angry and what do I say in my story? It's actually in this latest book because it's in my section of grief and loss, and I have a little section, loss of balance. So sort of loss of balance in life for different ages. And so he would, when the beekeeper was very angry, he would scream and shout and throw things about. He would shake his fists in the air and complain bitterly that life was unfair. And eventually he gets so angry, he wakes up the Thunder Man from his sleep up in the sky. And the Thunder Man, he first of all, because you've got to find a way where you're not doing the teacher talk, but you're still trying to get a message across. Yes. So the Thunder Man says, but don't you know about the angry dance? Why aren't you doing the angry dance when you're up? And then I can keep sleeping. You're not waking me up. And so he teaches the beekeeper the angry dance. Say, huff and bruff and stamp the ground, knock both knees and turn around. Do this when things don't go your way and life will get better every day. Do it 3 times. And so you can put a lot of will into those movements.
You can, and you know, a child has, like, when you're doing that, there's no way they can continue to have a meltdown.
Yeah.
They come out of it. They will come out of it.
And I mean, sometimes it's well, I raised 3 boys. I've probably had thousands of experiences, especially with my youngest. He knows he was my dramatic one.
We all have one of those.
And if you can ignore it and not give it attention, that's not a story. That's just a strategy.
Right.
Or give children love playful language. So perhaps the child is, what might they do? Perhaps they've knocked the chair over. And using a nonsense rhyme, chair bombare stickalaire, fi fair stickalaire. What are you doing with the chair?
I love that. Nonsense often stops them so quickly in their tracks because they are trying to really sort out what you said, and then they're either going to get more mad or they're going to start laughing.
Yes, sure. And it can sometimes help diffuse the situation.
Agreed.
I've given quite a few humorous and nonsense examples over this interview. I don't want people to think that that's the only style for therapeutic storytelling, because it's only a very small, from my experience, only a very small part of my work. But for these situations, singing, rhyming,
and I think the parent needs to not be crazy themselves. As moms, we have to be centered. So we have to take the time to listen to our own stories so that we can get our own heads right. Because when we are in that space, then we're a lot more equipped to meet these challenges, to tell the stories to the children, to be the person that can diffuse the bomb of the child, all of those things.
And having a few ideas just ready. Perhaps you've thought into a story. Perhaps it's drumsticks that are being so angry with the drum, and so the drumsticks aren't allowed in the orchestra. They have to, they're put outside, and the drumsticks go walking through the forest and start banging here and banging there. And anyway, just trying to work out and then find a way. How are we going to bring them back? How are they going to find a way? Perhaps they need to watch the weaver birds at work doing rhythmic work with their nest making, or just finding a way. And then eventually the drumsticks work out, we can do some rhythms. We can put our energy,
get invited back into the orchestra.
Do some, and then come back. So
those are some lovely ideas. I had another question here, and I'm agreeing with the answer that you and I discussed earlier. So maybe we can talk a little bit just about this. And this is the parental survival tips when we have deep melancholics. And I like your answer before of being really careful not to box children in, because I 1000% agree. Well, I think it is very important to understand temperament and understand development and understand all those pieces. We want to be careful that we're elevating our children out of those places rather than keeping them in a box.
Yes. And I worked in early childhood for quite a few years, and I was of the understanding that the temperaments hadn't even settled in. So
I usually don't see them until after 9.
Totally, just addressing the behavior and not getting. It's a bit like locking people into star signs.
I know it's hard.
It can be very valuable, very important, but be careful you don't get locked into the picture.
I agree. I completely agree, because I've watched my own children when they hit like past 9 and they hit puberty. they flipped. And so we have to be careful to look at what's ahead of us and what's in front of us. And definitely you're looking at the melancholic behavior and you're trying to sort through that behavior piece, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to box them in and worry about that for forever. We have to find ways to connect with them, I believe, even though we're struggling, it's usually our struggle. It's usually our struggle. And once we can get through that struggle, it makes sort of surviving more like thriving.
But for older children, then and I think the classic response here, people are probably already aware of it, you find stories of suffering, of characters in the story that have suffered. That'll really speak to them. And then through the journey of the story, the character finds a way to overcome them.
I completely agree. And that's one reason why the Waldorf curriculum is so beautiful, because there are those stories peppered throughout. And but no, you're absolutely right. That's the key to a melancholic's heart, is to help them to see that there other people have it worse than they do. Very much so. Goodness, I'm looking over our questions. I think we've gotten through so many things. I really want you to talk about your projects that you're working on. I want you to talk about your app that you've just developed, which I have downloaded on my phone, and I've been listening to it off and on, and I was diving into it a little bit more today. So please talk a little bit about that, because I find that to be such a necessary piece. There are very few good stories for children that we can, as parents, feel comfortable and confident allowing our kids to do. And so yours is definitely one of them. So talk a little bit about your app.
Thank you. And that's why I eventually agreed to do it. When the app developer in Europe approached me, I said, no, I don't want to do this. Parents and teachers, especially parents, should be reading the story. And he said, you don't live in the real world, Susan. Some parents are so busy and they will play other apps. And I then downloaded a couple of other storytelling apps. Some of them are free, but they have an ad that comes up every so often for poker machines or for, different things. And that is not healthy at all. So eventually, yes, I did agree to it. It's called Rainbow Tales. You'll find a link on my website, but you just go into your Apple store, or if you've got an Android device, into the whatever store it is where you buy them.
Google store.
You can listen for 2 weeks. There's 101 stories. You can listen for 2 weeks for free. I suggest you read the information on how to use the app, because there's how to navigate it. There's 6 different sections: stories for challenging behaviors, stories for challenging situations, stories for everyday challenges, resilience tales.
Because you call it out right in there. This is one for whinging. This is one, I love that. This is one for bullying.
And they're all the different colored books, so they all match into the different colors of the rainbow. There's beautiful little watercolor illustrations with each story. So you can listen for free for 2 weeks, and then the subscription, I think, is very reasonable. It's,
I think so too.
What, $2.99 US dollars a month?
99 cents a month in the United States.
Or a cup of coffee.
And you said that comes out to about $5 in Australia for our friends that are over there. That's a very reasonable price. Very reasonable price. And are you adding to these stories regularly, or like
the plan? I've got another 100 stories. There's 101 stories on the app. I've got another 100 stories to add to it. But until the app developer's invested his money into this, and until he gets it back, he's not ready to pay narrators and pay illustrators and so on. But it will be added to.
Of course.
So that is one thing.
100 stories is a lot of stories to start with, and there's a lot of great stories on there. And a lot of them, I'm understanding, are coming from all of your books and stuff. So
quite a lot. A few of them are new, but quite a lot are. And one other section is stories for grief and loss, even to do with if a child loses a pet, which is a very important part of a child's life. How do you approach that?
How to navigate that?
3 different examples there. So that's
when I get that question, I always say, go get Susan's book. Usually
yes. But you see, you may not find, I mean,
Right.
it's the tip of the iceberg, even all my 4 books. That's why I think it's important that we can find ways to create our own stories.
I
Because
completely,
sometimes, like the girl with the needing the story to use the wheelchair, that was such a unique situation that even if you went through every book, every folktale, every fairy tale, it would be hard to find something to speak directly to that
absolutely,
challenge.
absolutely agree. Learning
So
to tell stories is so
my
important.
next work, which I think is more important than my books, is I run online trainings. I
Right.
used to travel to the States, to China, to Asia, to Europe. I am going to South America in January and February to help launch a Portuguese edition of this, and doing some work in Mexico because my books are in Spanish. But mainly I run online trainings, and people can only run a couple a year. But if, for example, a group in America wanted a training, and they can then work out the time frame, because here now it's 10 in the morning my time, and it's
Right.
what is it where you are?
Quite a bit different. So that means there are 14 hours difference, I think.
Yes.
That's
But we
right.
could work out a time frame to suit a group. You just need to round up 10 or 12 people. I don't
Okay.
take much more than that
That's
in a
lovely.
training.
Does that actually answers another question on here? Somebody asks, how can I meet Susan?
Yes. So I run the trainings, and then I also run now, it's something new I started a year ago. I run 1-hour interactive sessions for individuals, or there might be 2 of you to share the money. And you come to the session with a case study, a story that you are hoping to write. And I have my whiteboard behind me. I know Zoom has a whiteboard, but I work off this. And together we create some ideas, and then the person paying for the session goes away and writes something, then shares it with me. So I'm doing that quite a bit now as well. So people can
really lovely.
find me through my website.
Space. That's lovely.
So that's another project. I've got 12 of my stories about to be turned into little films by a Chilean film director. They're in Spanish and English. Beautiful. They're quite beautifully done. She's been working on them for 3 years, and they're going to be launched later this year. And then there's going to be another lot started on. That's another project.
I'm so proud for you. That's so amazing.
Yes, it just keeps, one of my sons calls it the gift that keeps on giving, because stories, you don't know. I mean, look at this little storybook. I wrote an environmental fairy tale many years ago. It's in my first book, Garden of Light, the story. It found its way into Europe. This little book's funded by the EU. It's in conservation stores. It's about a king didn't care who takes over the land and digs up all the trees and flowers.
Isn't it on the app too? I think I listened.
It's on the app as well. Tree of Light, it's called on the app. And now it's even on billboards in some national parks in Europe.
Wow.
So that's certainly a surprise. The global reach of stories, but then stories speak to the heart. So in many ways, it's not surprising that that's what people are searching for.
I think people are really looking for a balm for the soul in the world today.
Yes, it is. It's soul food.
It is very much. Thank you so much for joining me today, Susan. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate what you shared. Appreciate you talking about your projects, and that's so exciting. I'm so excited for you to have these projects to film. I'm excited for the films. That really is wonderful. And we're going to share the app on our website, and we're going to share it on our socials so that everybody can get a piece of it. And it also will be available down below this video. So you'll be able to, or below this podcast, you'll be able to get all of the information for that and Susan's website as well. So thank you again. I really appreciate your time today.
And I have 30 seconds.
You absolutely can have all the time you want, my friend.
Because there was this lovely question that came through of a parent who makes up stories every night about what the child has done through the day. And she just uses animals to depict
That's
the different
right. The
things.
question in here, I didn't see.
Yes, and she feels that's not good enough, and I just want to congratulate her, because I think that is such a wonderful thing for a child to grow up having parents make up little stories. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to even have any major intention. So I just want to congratulate her that the human voice, the human sharing, is such a wonderful bond between children and parents.
It is 1000%. I can't agree more. I think our children are listening to us in the womb, and we're already beginning to work with them in that way. And so to be able to bring them beautiful stories, and sometimes even sad stories, is really what helps develop them and help them have a firm foundation.
Yes.
So much agree. So
Yes.
much agree. I'm so blessed that you were here with me tonight. Thank you so much.
Wonderful honor. Thank you very much. Hello to everyone across North America and wherever else you reach.
We reach all the world. So hopefully they'll hear you in Europe, and they'll hear you in South Africa, and they'll hear you in South America. So I'm super happy for all of the people that joined us today. And I thank you again so much, Susan.
Okay. Wonderful.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
If it's anything like our experience, we've been with Miss Daniela for 2 years. There's some transition period in the beginning for sure to like get the rhythm down of just something new. But beyond that, it's like the greatest gift for myself and my kids compared to us trying to struggle through homeschooling on our own in the beginning. And yeah, I do try to attend the parent office hours, and I highly recommend trying to do that if you can, because it really has become a really beautiful part of, I think, all of our weeks when we meet there and get to ask all kinds of questions and talk about all kinds of subjects. But yeah, it's wonderful. I love it.
Thank you so much for sharing. There's nothing like a returning family to help spread the love.